Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Newsom. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy at the Commonwealth Fund. The Commonwealth Fund is a nonpartisan foundation focused on improving access to equitable, high-quality, affordable care for all Americans. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for a conversation on how we prepare for the next pandemic and what policy opportunities we have to improve our nation's preparedness. I want to thank Anand and his team at BPC for their partnership and leadership in this space and for partnering on this critical issue with us today. In 2021, in the midst of COVID-19, the Commonwealth Fund saw a policy window for rethinking how we collectively rebuild our public health infrastructure in a more coherent and equitable way. We established a focus area on public health to support a cohesive body of work with the goal of informing policy efforts to stabilize and modernize the U.S. public health system at the federal and state levels. That work included the creation of a commission on a national public health system, which articulated a vision for how U.S. federal authorities, resources, and leadership could join to create a national public health infrastructure, one that improves health and equity every day and enhances the nation's preparedness for future crises. The commission report acknowledged that without strong national leadership, combined with sustained and stable funding for state and local public health, the U.S. will continue to be at risk from pandemics and public health emergencies that could prove catastrophic to our health and well-being, to our economy, and to our society as a whole. So today, with the public health emergency designation behind us, authorities in place, we're at a crossroads. Will we act to ensure that the U.S. has the authorities in place to prevent or respond to future pandemics and send clear direction to states and local communities? Or will we continue to fund public health emergency by public health emergency, creating a complicated patchwork of grant programs, reporting requirements, and burdens for public health professionals at all levels, while also leaving Americans vulnerable? Will we acknowledge the reality that many communities have had historical experiences that contribute to their mistrust of government and do the work that's necessary to build and rebuild trust? Congress has taken several steps recently to bolster certain elements of the federal pandemic response, including workforce programs and public health laboratory systems. But there is much more that we need to do to strengthen federal leadership as well as support state and localities.
My name is Dr. Anand Parikh. I'm the Chief Medical Advisor at BPC. Rachel, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to co-host today's event with the Commonwealth Fund. And I want to thank you for your partnership on this and the important contribution of the Fund's Commission on a National Public Health System. Good afternoon, everyone. Bipartisanship isn't always easy, but it is important. And it's crucial that reauthorization of PAHPA occurs in a bipartisan fashion. After all, public health emergencies, such as COVID-19, don't discriminate by party affiliation. We need to be unified in our preparedness and response to maximize resiliency and health. At the Bipartisan Policy Center, we believe that PAHPA reauthorization offers an opportunity to strengthen our readiness against all hazards. Our prior research, which resulted in the report entitled Positioning America's Public Health System for the Next Pandemic, led to one major conclusion: that when you have a crisis, there are three things you need to know. Number one, who's in charge? Number two, what does the data tell us so we know where we are and where we're headed? And number three, do we have the resources and capabilities to respond? Our report recommendations with respect to the first question focused on clarifying and strengthening federal operational roles and responsibilities during a response to a pandemic. While we were pleased to see Congress take up our recommendation for a formal White House structure by creating a new White House Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy, we believe there are additional opportunities to clarify authorities of entities such as HHS's Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, ASPR, among others. Our recommendations on data included establishing federal data collection and reporting standards to improve consistent collecting of core public health data across data systems, as well as encouraging further data exchange between clinical and public health organizations. And our recommendations on resources focused on addressing the significant underfunding of our public health system's capabilities, from assessment and planning to data and epidemiology to preparedness and response to communications and community partnerships. Beyond this, Congress has an opportunity to strengthen requirements to exercise operational plans through the Public Health and Hospital Preparedness Program grants, as well as evaluate our medical countermeasures enterprise. Today, we'll hear first from Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, ranking member on the Health Subcommittee of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. We were also hoping to hear from Congressman Richard Hudson from the subcommittee, but due to a scheduling conflict, the congressman couldn't join us. We do appreciate his leadership on this issue. BPC has had good conversations with both offices and remains committed to working with both sides of the aisle for a successful reauthorization of the Pandemic and All-Hazards Preparedness Act. We will also hear from two former HHS Assistant Secretaries for Preparedness and Response, both dedicated public servants who I knew when I first started working in the predecessor office to ASPR at HHS back in 2005. We're fortunate that Drs. Nikki Lurie and Bob Kadlec are here with us today.
I just want to thank the BPC team, thank our panel for joining us, and just really looking forward to the conversation around pandemic preparedness, really grounded in a strong base in public health. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Rachel. With that, I'll now turn it over to Congresswoman Anna Eshoo for her opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to address the Bipartisan Policy Center during its discussion on the upcoming reauthorization of PAHPA. My work on this legislation began soon after our country endured the attacks of September 11th and the anthrax attacks that followed shortly thereafter. Congress realized our country was not prepared to coordinate responses to mass casualty events or chemical attacks. I then authored legislation that was signed into law in 2006 and was most recently reauthorized in 2019, an effort I led with my great partner, the former Congresswoman Susan Brooks. Since its creation, PAHPA has been hugely successful. For example, BARDA has led to 78 FDA approvals of medical countermeasures. Without BARDA's important work, we wouldn't have been blessed with a safe and effective COVID vaccine as quickly as we were. The 2023 PAHPA reauthorization must meet the challenges we witnessed during the COVID pandemic and anticipate the challenges of the future. COVID exposed the fragility of our supply chains, especially for pharmaceutical and medical products. Yet who supplies many critical drug elements, including active pharmaceutical ingredients, is still a mystery. We need to fix these gaps in knowledge and our supply chain if we're ever to feel secure in our ability to respond to a health threat. We must also create a 6-month buffer stock for the pediatric oncology drugs that are consistently in shortage. I'm hopeful that my Republican partner in PAHPA, Congressman Richard Hudson of North Carolina, will commit to including drug shortage policy in the upcoming PAHPA reauthorization. He's been a good partner, and there are clear, common sense solutions to address the acute drug shortage crisis that we now have in our country. I look forward to working with Representative Hudson and the Bipartisan Policy Center to pass bipartisan PAHPA legislation to ensure our country is doing its best to prepare for the worst. Thank you for including me in your important event.
Thank you, Congresswoman Eshoo. At this point, I'd like to introduce Maya Goldman. Maya is the healthcare reporter for Axios, and she will be moderating today's discussion between Drs. Lurie and Dr. Kadlec. Maya, over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello. Thank you to the BPC for hosting this conversation. My name is Maya Goldman, and I'm a health policy reporter for Axios. I co-author a newsletter that follows what Congress is doing on healthcare, and PAHPA is a big part of that right now. I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about pandemic preparedness and PAHPA with Dr. Nicole Lurie, who served as the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at HHS for 8 years during the Obama administration, and Dr. Bob Kadlec, who also served as ASPR during the Trump administration and who led us through the early days of COVID-19. So to zoom out a little bit, to start, the original PAHPA legislation established ASPR within HHS, and that's a role, as I just said, that you both previously held. So how has ASPR evolved over the years, and what role do you see it playing in the future of pandemic preparedness?
Nikki, if I may start,
Yeah.
I would just, first of all, like to thank you, Maya, and Anand, and the Bipartisan Commission to basically allow us to have this opportunity to talk with the viewership and kind of relate our kind of impressions and experiences. But probably the most important thing, and I think Representative Anna Eshoo, who was a plank holder for the original PAHPA, as she described, I think kind of touched on the origins of ASPR as really emanating from the events post 9/11, where there was a lot of concern about mass casualty situations like witnessed on 9/11, the risk of CBRN events that were always a matter of concern, particularly around terrorism. And then incrementally that changed, and quite frankly, during my tenure in the Senate, it was evident from Katrina, a natural, probably the first big natural catastrophe that we experienced recently, and this was before the recognition of global climate change, that those kinds of incidents were likely to play a central role. And certainly they did, and particularly in my tenure, where I had three major hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria. So it was an incremental growth of what would say terrorism, natural catastrophes, and then also the risk of pandemics and emerging infectious diseases. And here's something I would just say initially, that during the Bush administration, where I served in the White House on the Homeland Security Council, that was a central issue. And even though we wrote a lot of the documents around it, it was Nikki who actually had to respond to the first pandemic as an ASPR. And so I'll defer to her for her kind of insights on that.
Great. No, thanks. I think, Bob, that was a great rendition of sort of the early pieces of how this evolved. And, you know, it's interesting. Bob and I have had the opportunity to work back and forth in different roles on these issues for long before either of us ended up at HHS in ASPR. And the incremental changes and the incremental growth in ASPR have been quite important. You know, early on, the recognition, the sort of who's in charge question, which sort of plagues us and continues to plague us, certainly starting with H1N1 and then moving through to Ebola and other kinds of issues. We saw, first of all, that it's a lot more than HHS that's involved in all of these public health emergencies. And certainly with COVID, all the issues that related to underlying social determinants of health and how policies across government that impact those play a role, super important, whether it's the Department of Commerce and keeping business open, the Department of Education and keeping schools open, the Department of Transportation and cross-state transport of goods, et cetera. Another place where I think there's been a tremendous evolution is that in the first PAHPA and when BARDA was created, it was really created to think about medical countermeasures against bioterror threats. And there was a list of bioterror threats created by the Department of Homeland Security that BARDA got to work on, and it got to work, thankfully, on pandemic influenza. But I think it's taken a very, very long time, number one, to realize that Mother Nature remains the most effective bioterrorist there is, whether it's now, natural disasters often that are caused by underlying human behavior. But COVID is just a really great example of an emerging infectious disease. And there will be many, many more of those that are not pandemic influenza, that are not COVID, but are going to be something else that comes out of thin air that we now recognize as territory for countermeasure development, et cetera. The other area in countermeasure development that I just highlight is this opportunity that you don't have to have a one drug, one bug approach. And so whether that had to do with the platform development that we all started that ultimately led to mRNA vaccines, or many of the areas of progress in antimicrobial resistance, where we were able to say, gosh, if we need to make an antibiotic for multi-drug resistant anthrax, should it treat your multi-drug resistant gonorrhea at the same time? So there's been constant evolution, I think, and expansion there. And then finally, increasing recognition of the interplay between ASPR responsibilities and public health responsibilities and infrastructure over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to come back to that interplay. But first, we have this reauthorization in front of us this year. What are your priorities, both of you, for PAHPA reauthorization? Let's start with Dr. Kadlec.
Well, thank you, Maya, again. And I have several. Unfortunately, I have a list that probably is longer than this program, lots to describe just because of my experiences during the COVID pandemic. But I think there are four principal things that I would recognize. One has already come to pass, and that is making ASPR an operating division. The second one is ensuring that the secretary has a fund like the Disaster Relief Fund. So this is in addition to the CDC's rapid response to an emerging infectious disease outbreak, for example, but a large fund probably in the billions, tens of billions of dollars, like the DERF, that would be available for response to large-scale catastrophic events like a pandemic, but it could be other things as well, that would not limit or, if you will, delay the ability to mount an effective response. And that was a significant lesson learned for me. The other issue is a closer integration with FEMA, of all people, because quite frankly, even though ASPR kind of leads the ESF 8 public health and medical response piece of the national response framework, particularly in something that has a large health care component to it or public health care component to it, there needs to be closer integration. And we learned that from Crimson Contagion, unfortunately, in the fall of 2019. And actually, it started integrating ourselves closer with FEMA. Eddie Gabriel, God bless him, was the beachhead of that in the headquarters of FEMA in November of 2019, in advance of the pandemic. But I think there needs to be closer national and regional integration to enable and to leverage what FEMA does every day in its preparedness and exercise programs. The last thing I'll just leave you with is really, how do we institutionalize what were the great benefits of accelerating countermeasure development that we did? You heard Anna Eshoo talk about the great success of BARDA. BARDA was the heart of Warp Speed, or the countermeasure acceleration group. Whatever you call it, it was the centerpiece of that. And there has to be ways to institutionalize that capability so that for future events and just on a regular basis, we can accelerate. And with that, one last tag issue is the industrial base and supply chain issues that Anna Eshoo talked about, that include our ability to maintain a robust but affordable strategic national stockpile.
Absolutely. And Dr. Lurie?
Great. Well, let me build on the great list that Bob started. And for me, number one on that list, which he highlighted, is the ability to have money and move money really, really quickly. That was an issue that plagued me as well. It takes 9 months to go through when you have an emergency supplemental to when money hits the street that somebody can use. And that is not response time by any stretch of the imagination. I have a couple of others that I think we ought to talk about. The first is, when something happens and it's local, you can get your arms around what's going on. When it's national, you need a national picture. And you need a national picture to, especially in infectious disease, to know where it is, to know where it's going, to be able to understand what kinds of resources are going to be needed, to prioritize those resources, whether it's from the strategic national stockpile or anything else. And you can't do that without data. Right now, we're still dependent on data use agreements with 50 states and all the territories to have a view of what's going on. And certainly early on in COVID, everybody was flying blind because we didn't have, HHS didn't have the authorities to get data except in a very, very cumbersome path. And so those authorities are really needed to get a picture of what's going on, to understand what the status of the healthcare system is and where it needs help. And the ASPR needs them, CDC needs them, NIH needs them, The rest of the government needs them because it's all communities that are affected in really different ways. So for me, the authorities to require the data collection and reporting of laboratory data and the data of the status of the healthcare system are absolutely essential. Most of the time that all those data could be anonymized. And if you invested in modern IT, it would also be much more secure. Privacy would be much better protected. The second thing for me is that you can't respond without day-to-day systems in place. And the day-to-day system that was not in place was the public health system. It had been disinvested in for years. Many components of the public health system couldn't meet their core capabilities. We heard still, I mean, when Anna and I first started in this, we were talking about fax machines. The fact that we're still talking about fax machines in COVID was amazing to me. And we don't have a way to get to something remotely standardized in a national public health system. This doesn't mean undoing the Constitution, but it does mean having a situation where states and locals can meet their core capabilities. So that's number one about investment. And number two, it's having CDC have the authority to be able to measure and report on the capabilities at the state and local level, and to have the flexibility with its resources to have some carrots and sticks to be sure those capabilities are in place. Those are my top two. Like Bob, there are a bunch of issues in the supply chain that I worry about a lot. A really small one is we can talk about building up the strategic national stockpile and all the buffer systems we want. Right now, HHS doesn't have the authority to know what's out there in the commercial supply chain, because that's also commercial, confidential, and competitive information. And yet a lot of what we need is out there. It's misplaced, it's piled up in different places, and we ought to have in a crisis the ability to see where it is and to redirect it if needed.
Those are all great wish lists, but we have to actually get there, as you both know. And so the current Congress is, we have divided Congress. It has had a hard time agreeing on many policies so far. How do you see this unique congressional dynamic affecting PAHPA so far? Dr. Lurie, why don't we start with you?
Well, I mean, people are divided, and bringing people together is exactly what the Bipartisan Policy Center is about. And it's what we need to do. I mean, I think that we understood that COVID didn't discriminate between red states and blue states, between Democrats and Republicans. Almost everybody knows somebody or had a close relative that either got very, very sick or died from COVID. And so I think, quite honestly, there's really a chance and an opportunity to make common cause around something that is so near and dear, not just to our health, but frankly, to our national security. And one of the things that I've appreciated about PAHPA over the years is it has made public health emergency response, and preparedness a health security issue and a U.S. national security issue. And I think if we can keep focused on that we need to do this for our national security, I think we probably have the best chance of moving forward. It doesn't mean these other things aren't important to national security, but it's pretty hard to disagree with the fact that our country needs to be safe.
Yeah. Dr. Kadlec, what do you think?
I'd just like to reemphasize there are 1.12 million reasons why there needs to be a bipartisan accord in this particular legislation. And to Nikki's point, it's the number of Americans that were lost. But it's more than that. It's a generation of children whose education and whose learning have been disrupted. It's the $1 trillion of economic loss that we've suffered as a country, and a whole host of other downstream secondary psychological impacts on our society and on individuals who suffered and still are suffering, such as with long COVID. So that should be the rallying cry, I think. The other part of this is that, yes, we are divided, but that's how our founders decided that this country would best be, run with a divided government with executive and legislative branches. But I think it's because of those transcending commitments to a better ideal of, as Nikki said, a safer and a healthier society and country, a stronger country. Those are the things that should bring us all together.
Yeah. And so the House's draft reauthorization language as it currently stands is not bipartisan right now. How should we view that as onlookers? What does that signify to you both?
Well, for me, at least, it's kind of like ops normal in terms of my own experience in drafting the original PAHPA with Senator Burr and Senator Kennedy. There was a time when we had a draft, but that draft served as the vehicle by which we were able to gain bipartisan support and identify issues that needed to be added. I think historically, interesting enough, Senator Clinton was championing even then the issues around influenza preparedness. And others, Senator Harkin, who contributed significantly to BARDA's creation. So there is a lot of room for opportunity and improvement. And the fact that there is if you will, a Republican draft right now is less worrying is as long as the Republicans and Democrats are talking and negotiating around any draft, that should hopefully lead to some positive resolution.
Yeah, I would completely agree with Bob there. I mean, there are certainly a lot of ideas on both the Republican and the Democratic side, and I think that there is a lot of room for discussion and negotiation. I think what we have going on in Congress in part now is we have going on in the entire country a huge amount of post-pandemic frustration and anger that people are sort of taking out on one another. As opposed to something else. And I think there's a great opportunity to try to model something else here. If they can. But I think that really good ideas are going to rise to the top. And I think at the end of the day, Americans want this done. They don't want a repeat performance of what's just happened.
Yeah, that would definitely be worst case scenario. One of the big issues that's currently driving a wedge between House Democrats and Republicans, which Congresswoman Eshoo alluded to, is whether this PAHPA reauthorization should deal with drug shortages and specifically oncology drugs and other drugs that have been in very short supply right now. What do you both think of that? I'm curious.
So, I'll say that, as I said before, good response builds on the back of day-to-day systems. And I'll tell you that during my time in ESPR, I ended up getting involved in multiple shortages. Things as elemental as normal saline, not even oncology drugs. And that a number of the kinds of principles that you had to use to conserve, reuse, allocate, God, I forbid I say ration, are the kinds of things that we found that we needed to do in the middle of a pandemic, right? And we found that we needed to do other things. So I think my comments about the supply chain also go on here. You need a buffer. You need a ready reserve. You need an industrial base. You need all of these things, not just for oncology drugs, but to be able to respond to just about anything. I think about the fact that Easter weekend, I got this panicked phone call from New York. I wasn't even in government. Easter weekend 2020. And they said, we're out of dialysis fluid in New York, and the kidney doctors are making up fluid batches in their kitchens and bringing it into the hospitals. Can you help us? Right? And the answer was really that there was a whole bunch of it piled up in Oklahoma, but nobody wanted to admit that it was there and release it. So and I'm telling you this because if we deal with day-to-day drug shortages, day-to-day product shortages, get the authorities and the systems to do it, we're gonna be better prepared to deal with next real crisis when there's tons and tons of stuff in short supply. So I wouldn't segregate them. I know there's a difficult political path to thread to get people to think about broad or narrow authorities and PAHPA. But the same stuff you need to do for drug shortages, you need to be able to do in the next emergency.
Absolutely. Dr. Kadlec?
Well, I certainly endorse what Nikki said, and I would just offer one other piece, which was my experience as ASPR. And again, it happened well before the pandemic, and that was the recognition after a natural catastrophe like Maria that normal saline and pediatric IV bags were in short supply as a consequence of that. And so the point here is it doesn't take much in any of our medical supply chains, which are very brittle and oftentimes have a foreign supply component to it, where they can be interrupted. So one of the things that I think is a real strong opportunity in this next PAHPA bill is to really look around innovation. One of the things that we tried to do to address what Nikki was talking about around normal saline was how can we make it distributed manufacturing capacity to do that? And yes, there are things that ASPR and BARDA invested in, and now the industrial base group for ASPR, a new entity that now exists, which is a great call by our successor, Don O'Connell, is really to focus on how can we ensure this sanctity and sustainability of future supply chains through smart investments, through innovation, and through a commitment to help create a public-private partnership around that to do that. So, I think while there may be some quibbling about supply chains, I think the opportunities for improvements are many and diverse. And I think there's plenty of opportunity to kind of find solutions that both the Republicans and Democrats would endorse.
Yeah, definitely. And you both have sort of talked about this, but this question of drug shortages and whether they belong in PAHPA is really just one element of a bit broader question, which is what fits in this package? How do we decide how big this package should be? How do we decide what actually is germane to pandemic and all hazards preparedness? So what advice, as former ASPRs, would you both give to lawmakers trying to decide this right now? How do you decide what fits into this?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say, this is about authorities. It's not about money. And you can't do a whole lot without the authorities. Obviously, you need the money too, but let's get the authorities in place that we're going to need and that we're going to need to respond. And let's move more, especially because finances are going to be really tight, in a multidimensional mode where investments serve multiple purposes. So one could view that dealing with drug shortages and having systems in place and being able to see what's in the supply chain and all those things will really help you deal with drug shortages. For example, for me, as I said, I think the most important thing is to recognize that you can't manage a public health emergency without a functioning public health system, and you can't manage it without the data to make it work. So for me, both of those have really got to be in. I know that there are some concerns around the edges and things that get people nervous, but those things I think are really, really solvable with a little bit of explanation and creative thinking. But for me, that stuff has to be in. For me, the ability to move money has to be in. And we need to look at and imagine all of the kinds of things that could happen, that might happen, understand how we're prepared for them, and understand how we don't have single-use investments.
Yeah. Dr. Kadlec, anything to add?
No, I would just say to Nikki's point, she's identified some real critical areas there, particularly around authorities. We talked about the authorities around, supply chains and industrial base expansion. Those are certain things that are not identified or articulated in the current PAHPAs, the original or subsequent reauthorizations. Perfect opportunity. It should also be things about how can we accelerate our acceleration or pace of development, either with innovation or just simply by kind of guiding ourselves through to how do we prepare for the next possible set of events. History has shown us that we can't predict very well. And I just think the fact is you have to have a much broader aperture. I think in today's world, particularly, and I just offer this as one thought, is that, where we started off in this imperfect incrementalism focused around terrorism and then about, global climate change or natural disasters, that now we're faced with some other challenges that have to be recognized as being very significant. The events in Ukraine, the events in our competition with China, which has multiple dimensions that relate to our supply chain, as well as the possibility of some kind of, trade war or even real war. So the thing is, there are all kinds of things that are existing today that didn't exist in 2005 and 6, or when we did the last reauthorization in 2019, that somehow have to be factored in. And to Nikki's point, which I haven't mentioned before, is how do we ensure the capacity and sustainability of a strong public health system, as well as a healthcare system that complements that public health system.
So just building on Bob's comment there, there are two parts of that three that probably really strike me. I think we all agree on this issue about needing to build and have a strong public health system. I helped to staff the commission that Rachel talked about, the Commonwealth Commission on a National Public Health System. And I think one of the realizations there, and it's something that clearly I confronted as ASPR, is that it's nobody's responsibility to build a strong public health system. CDC has a very defined set of responsibilities. And even if CDC were perfect, we could fail right now because we don't have a strong national public health system. We don't have a clear view of a public health workforce and its needs. We'd have a very rickety laboratory system. We talked about the data issues. We've got a whole bunch of IT issues to start with. And public health responsibilities are scattered across HRSA, SAMHSA, CDC, et cetera. ASPR wasn't created as a public health organization, and it's not. And bizarrely for me, where there's a ton of public health capability, CMS, and particularly through Medicare data and the kinds of programs that Medicare runs, it's not a public health service agency technically or legally. So I think HHS for this modern day and age is frankly organized wrong to think about how we're going to get to a real public health system, because there's nobody in charge of doing that. Certainly, it's not an ASPR responsibility. And I think at the end of the day, that's why the commission recommended that there be an undersecretary or a deputy secretary of some kind for public health. I don't for a moment think it's going to make it in PAHPA, but I think that we have to really pay attention to that, because the system's perfectly designed to get the results that it does, and it's not getting the results that we need.
Yeah. Dr. Lurie, can you expand a little bit on how you think all these different HHS divisions need to work together on, under this current system that may be flawed?
Well, again, I mean, it's so interesting to me. There are really important workforce initiatives scattered across the department. Many of them are in HRSA because there's a workforce to deal with underserved populations. Many of them are in SAMHSA now because of the opioid crisis. There's workforce money in CDC, and right now CDC is in a position where it's going to put about $3.5 billion out on the street so that public health departments can hire people. But hire them for what? It ought to be in my own mind that there are enough strings attached so you hire them to be able to meet the core public health capabilities that you need. States and local governments, when they come to HHS, they have to go to many, many places. There's no real front door to deal with workforce issues that might affect opioids or maternal mortality or aging or anything else, for example. The same with all the data systems and the capabilities. And the current structure, with a very strong secretary and deputy secretary, is all taken up by dealing with the urgent issues. And there is no place where one could sit back and do that. There is an assistant secretary for health. That office has over years been decimated. It doesn't have authority to do what would need to be done, let alone personnel and budget. I would highlight that there's tremendous capability in CMS to use CMS data for Medicare and Medicaid, its data authorities, to do a ton of public health good. And they got a lot of financial carrots and sticks as well. So I know Bob struggled mightily with visibility about what was the status of the healthcare system. Do hospitals, need to report on how full their beds are, or what their staffing are, or these other things. And there was no standardization, and it was just a huge headache. They finally got to a much better place, but a huge headache. CMS has a lot of authorities and a lot of capabilities to make stuff like that happen. But they have to view themselves as more than just folks that pay the bills.
Yeah. Dr. Kadlik, what do you have to add about how these different agencies should work together?
Well, I mean, so the practical reality is, I think what Nikki talked about is that for the secretary and deputy secretary, they are driven by the urgent, less so the important, and the role of an undersecretary or undersecretaries in HHS could serve a very valuable role in kind of managing, the important, so that others can do the urgent. And I think that's where I would come down on that. The experience I had during the pandemic is that we had this disaster leadership group, which was a very effective, if you will, way to communicate internally, that Nikki set up during her tenure, just wasn't sufficient to manage a very large event that we ultimately had to employ FEMA's infrastructure organization, Unified Command Group, to actually incorporate key elements of the health capabilities of HHS, CDC, the Assistant Secretary of Health, the ASPR, to kind of integrate that with the larger interagency response network. And so the thing is that you're never going to find the perfect solution, but you do need at least a structural organization that's going to advantage you and not disadvantage you going forward. And that's where I think the Bipartisan Center has been spot on in its recommendations, looking at looking how we can improve the day-to-day operation of HHS, because that will necessarily translate to how well it will operate in a crisis.
Yeah, I think I was spot on those FEMA issues. I know when I was asked where FEMA came in to staff the Emergency Operations Center at CDC during Ebola, during a huge influx of unaccompanied kids, we formed a unified command with FEMA and the Department of Defense. And that's really important in a crisis. The stronger your day-to-day system is, the less you're going to need those crisis resources. So it's not one or the other, it's both and. You've got to build that strong day-to-day system, and then you'll need that crisis system less, but you'll still need it.
Yeah. So as you have mentioned already, back in December, Congress directed the White House to create its own new pandemic response office. So, given all that we've talked about, how do you see that office working with ASPR, and what might we want to see in PAHPA to clarify that?
Well, I'll take a first swag at it because, quite frankly, it does do a very important thing that, unfortunately, over a series of several administrations, we've kind of seen it wax and wane, the role of a senior official in the White House. And I think that was one of the significant deficiencies in the Trump White House, was the elimination of the senior level position that was Admiral Tim Ziemer. That happened, about a year and a half before the pandemic occurred. And then it became a kind of an ad hoc pickup game where you had to import somebody who really didn't have the familiarity with the personalities in the White House, the processes in the White House, and then trying to insert in the middle of a crisis to try to find an effective means to manage something. So the idea of the Prevent Bill's creation is really institutionalizing what I think Ken Bernard was the first one of, and I think I was the third one of, and then Beth Cameron, I think, was the fourth or fifth one of. But it's this idea that you really do need a steady presence of someone in the White House who can manage these issues pre-crisis, and most importantly, manage the interagency policy processes that, quite frankly, were given to the ASPR to do the National Biodefense Strategy. Great idea, wrong person. it would also, be I think appropriate for the public health emergency medical countermeasure enterprise to be run out of the White House, because that is not only a multi-agency effort in the HHS, but it crosses the Department of Defense as well and Department of Agriculture. So these are things that I think naturally would be responsible to that office and that person. And so, I can't say enough, but it's time to fill that role, and then, give it some resources so they can do their mission, and let's get on with it, because we're kind of walking on thin ice in our experience with these kinds of health crises. So I'll go to Nikki then.
Yeah, no, I would very much add to that. I will say I did manage the Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasure Enterprise from HHS with DoD and the Department of Agriculture, and I've built great relationships. Having at least a co-manager in the White House also gets you the budget advocacy when you need it, and that's really important. But there's a part of this that's never been in this job description at the White House, and that's having all the rest of society prepared. It's about education policy, transportation policy, housing policy, right? It's about, we're going to have a national sick leave policy. All of those kinds of things that we saw, we were completely unprepared to deal with and dealt with very poorly in the pandemic, could benefit from a ton of preparedness work. I will say they were all issues in every emergency that I dealt with that got elevated to the White House for coordination and collaboration, but no one had really picked up the ball and done most of the preparedness work, with the exception of a little work in the Department of Education. And so for me, I see that as part and parcel of what that office needs to do, even if it's going to have the national security title to it. Typically the Domestic Policy Council does those things, but they're not the effective entity to deal with these issues. I think we'll get much better social policy out of this at the end of the day, and certainly much better preparedness and crisis policy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we're definitely eagerly watching to see how the White House rolls that out. I have a question from the audience here. How should we engage vulnerable communities to prepare them for future and present pandemics?
I'll take a first swipe at it, because we did it under crisis, and quite frankly, I think you can model it for pre-crisis or baseline scenarios, and that was principally we employed our NDMS and our Public Health Commission Corps officers to actually go into those areas that were vulnerable or represented at high risk for events. And particularly with COVID, it was the idea of access and equity in terms of countermeasures, particularly the infusible countermeasures, the immunoglobulins, and the recognition that the challenge for many of those populations, and some of them were on Indian reservations as well as inner cities, as well as in rural areas. We did that all based on what we could do at the time. But it's this idea of, if you will, familiarizing yourself with those communities and really working with them in a pre-crisis setting to kind of address what I think has historically been a significant challenge in terms of equity, not just in terms of countermeasures, but in just basic healthcare. And so I think that is a very important piece of the puzzle that ASPR can contribute to, but that's beyond just simply what ASPR can or should do. And so I'll stop and turn to Nikki.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on, Bob, about needing to have this pre-crisis and in advance. And, most communities, first of all communities have vulnerable populations in them, and you ought to be able to use basic data to figure out where they are and to some things about who they are. But health departments, commerce departments, others really ought to be the link to those community organizations that are trusted agents in those communities, that serve those communities. They ought to be able to fund some of them to keep those communities, organized, mobilized, have a cadre of people who are the trusted agents and messengers. And it's not just one-way communication. It's also being sure that communities can tell their local and state governments what it is that they need, where the trouble spots are, how they can help, et cetera. And ultimately, a strong public health system involves communities and those community groups from the get-go. Again, it's not just for a pandemic emergency. We have a maternal mortality emergency going on right now. We know we have an opioid emergency going on right now. It's usually the same community groups that get involved in all of those things. And I'll just point to my experience during COVID and in DC and having the honor and privilege of working with LaQuandra Nesbitt, the health commissioner, and others, and folks from the Black Coalition Against COVID that said, gosh, we have a whole HIV infrastructure, a whole set of other community-based infrastructures that we need to mobilize and put to this use, a whole faith community infrastructure that we need to mobilize and put to this use. But it took a lot of work to get them back up and activated because, their funding had dried up, their money had dried up, there was tons of know-how on the ground. But again, we let that stuff wither on the vine. And all of that has to be part of a strong system. The last thing I'll say is, when I keep harping on data and I talk about data going to the federal government, data needs to go back to communities. Community members need to be able to see themselves there and understand what the issues are, just like hospitals need to understand what's going on in their communities. And so I think we could just do a ton of a better job there. It's going to take a lot of trust building, but I think the will is there. Some funding flexibility will help a lot.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about timing before the end of the hour here. Obviously, the goal is to reauthorize PAHPA on time before the end of the fiscal year, but reauthorization has been delayed before. So what are the implications of not getting a new bill passed before the end of the fiscal year? Dr. Kadlik, do you want to start?
Well, I'm less concerned about timing of getting it done by the end of the fiscal year, but getting the things that need to get done, period. I think we'd be foolish to trade the idea of urgency to meet some kind of artificial time frame to the point of actually saying this event, a 5-year reauthorization, only happens so often, right? Every 5 years, and given what we've been through, it would be better to spend extra time in the due diligence to evaluate the full breadth of what needs to be done and ensuring that we can do as much as we can. We started this conversation talking about the imperfect incrementalism that was represented by the start of this whole office, ASPR, and how it's changed as a result of events. It's changed because of other factors, and we've had probably the biggest public health crisis this nation has encountered in its history with COVID. And so I think, to me, if it takes an extra few months, it shouldn't take an extra term of Congress, but an extra few months to get it and get it done right. I think that's the trade space we should be operating in.
Yeah.
I think I generally agree with Bob, but I also just worry that it's, especially in an election season, it's just going to drag on and on and on and not get done. And then I think we have to look at what are things you can only do with the authorities in place and spend with the authorities in place. And particularly, either when it comes to BARDA or some of the other authorities for the National Medical System, others that operate in the background all the time. I think we need to get it done, and particularly on the BARDA end, not slow down the stuff that's in place. BARDA depends hugely on public-private partnerships. And when industry detects the government's not going to be a reliable player, they back off. That's largely why most of large pharma didn't get involved early on in COVID. I think if they start seeing that we're not going to be able to be a reliable partner as government, we're just going to have an awful lot of rebuilding to do. And it would be better not to squander the trust in the first place. I think we just went through a version of that the past couple of weeks with the debt ceiling stuff. I actually think that where there's a will, there's a way. And I think we could get it done. And if we could get, probably champions in each of the four corners I think they could come together and get this done.
Yeah. So we're nearing the end of the hour, and I would love to hear, before we go, just some final wrap-up thoughts from each of you, and maybe a lesson or two from your time at Asper Story that you think encapsulates what needs to be done here in PAHPA. Dr. Lurie, do you want to start?
Well, I think I've sort of highlighted my priorities, and I think Bob highlighted his priorities, and I think they're pretty aligned and overlapped. I think that those are things that need to be done. I think, what I would say in terms of a lesson or two would be, number one, for me, a really big lesson about not having single-use, multi-purpose investments, as I talked about. For a long time, this dual use thing was a four-letter word that you couldn't speak about, but I think we have to be talking about dual use. What we haven't talked about, except around the edges, is just sort of how politically challenging it is. When you're managing an emergency, everything you do, every decision you make is under a microscope. And when the emergency is over, you find that the retrospectoscope is much more powerful than even the microscope. And so one of the things that happens is that nobody wants to make early decisions. Nobody wants to take risks because people, are worried about being wrong, as opposed to being worried about being right. And people are worried about getting beat up on. It also makes it really, really hard when the event is over to tell the truth about what happened, so you can learn lessons from that. And if there were, and it leads to this just incredible groupthink. So I think if there were one thing that I would take away from it, is that we need to find a way to get rid of all the anger and the finger pointing and take some steps back and think really truthfully and honestly across a bunch of crises about what happened and what really needs to be in place across our social fabric to do so much better the next time.
Absolutely.
Well, hopefully from this conversation, I would just make the observation that the differences between Nikki's experience and mine are not very big, that we're on the margins, may use different words or adjectives, but I think the essence of what we've discussed today is in line with what I think could be a bipartisan agreement to get things done. And to Nikki's point, we need to look at this with the steely-eyed, cold truth of what worked, what didn't. But the two lessons that I take away from this is we always need to remember who we're supporting, and always to recognize that it's an Americans in need and others, quite frankly, because America is a great country for a lot of reasons, but we also don't just consider ourselves as the only people who benefit from what we do. And I'll just say, witness the Ebola crisis, where we provided incredible support to Africa during the times both of Nikki's tenure and mine. The second thing is just that this business, what we're talking about, is about saving lives and preventing preventable morbidity. And this is really the highest calling of any public servant, whether they be in the healthcare business or not. And I think in some ways that has to be the driving force, that regardless of where we sit and where we stand and who we support on any given day, that's the number one thing we keep our eye on the prize. The last thing I'll just say is just thank the Bipartisan Center for everything that they've done, not only just today, but in to lead up to today, and what you all are trying to do, which is really, bring the best of both views together to find a path to success. And in this case, success means we can prevent needless suffering and loss of life when the next event, not if, when the next event happens.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much to you both. That's all our time today, but this has been a great conversation. Dr. Lurie, Dr. Kadlec, of course, the Bipartisan Policy Center, thank you so much for participating and for all of your insights. And we're excited to see how this unfolds. Have a nice afternoon.
You did a great job moderating.
Thank you, Maya.